Hi, this is Layli Miller-Muro, the CEO of the Tahirih Justice Center. And tonight there has been some very dramatic events happening on the Ninth Circuit. Also, we're getting reports from around the country that mass raids are taking place according to another executive order's directive to deport what appears to be as many people as possible, regardless of whether they're convicted criminals. So first, on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals tonight, in a very, very surprising move, it happens extremely rarely, although the Ninth Circuit decided last night to reject the federal government's motion to suspend the temporary restraining order, which was preventing the implementation of the executive order that placed the travel ban on the 7 countries that has been widely discussed. The Ninth Circuit, in a very longly worded, well-reasoned, legally thought-out decision just last night, rejected the government's request. Then the White House said that it would not appeal that rejection to the Supreme Court, but would rather let the lower court go ahead and make some determinations around the constitutionality and the statutory viability of the executive order and focus on basically the substance of the case rather than on these procedural motions about temporary restraining orders and motions to stay. Just a few minutes after that, the White House then came back and said, forget that, we may in fact appeal. So there are very conflicting statements coming out from the White House about what they will do in response to the Ninth Circuit motion. But then what happened just a couple of hours ago, which has sent us all in shock, is that a very rarely used procedural mechanism has just been employed on the Ninth Circuit, and that is that a judge, a completely unrelated judge, to the 3 judges that heard the arguments in the Ninth Circuit appeal by the government arguing that the lower court's imposition of a temporary restraining order was wrong and shouldn't be allowed to hold. This other judge, not one of the 3 judges that heard the case, but another judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has made a sua sponte motion that the case be heard en banc. Now, what that means is that this particular judge on the Ninth Circuit wants to take the case away from those 3 judges that made the decision and bring it to be heard by all 25 judges that are on the Ninth Circuit. And so when a case is requested to be heard en banc, it's basically saying this case is so important that we shouldn't let 3 judges decide, and the whole bench, en banc, it's a Latin term, the whole judicial bench, all the judges in the Ninth Circuit should hear this case and weigh in on it. In order for that to happen, there has to be a vote, a majority vote by all 12 judges to determine whether or not they want to second guess the decision that these 3 judges made. A vote will only happen after legal arguments are made. So all of the attorneys in the case, including the Tahirih Justice Center, got notices just a few hours ago that there had been this sua sponte motion by this one other Ninth Circuit judge asking that a full vote happen on the Ninth Circuit to determine whether or not they should revisit the decision that was made just last night by these 3 judges and have the whole court, all 25 judges, hear the argument. Now, this is a fellow judge making this motion. It's not one of the litigants. It was not Washington State who made the motion, and it was not the federal government who made the motion. So this is very unusual for this to happen. So all of the attorneys in the case have been told that briefs arguing whether or not it should be heard en banc need to be submitted by Thursday. So that's the timeline, is on Thursday. And then at some point after that, all the judges on the Ninth Circuit will vote and decide whether they leave the decision that was made last night by these 3 judges alone, or whether they take it over and all 25 judges end up hearing the case. So it's very interesting because it's not about whether or not the White House has appealed the case, and it doesn't even involve the Supreme Court. It's about the Ninth Circuit itself. One judge on the Ninth Circuit saying, hold on, this should really be heard by the whole court, and that these three judges that made a decision last night shouldn't be able to do that. Now, he didn't argue the merits in that motion, at least not in the legal documents that I was given to read about it. But this is so rare that this happens, and it's just incredibly fascinating. Then on top of that, Trump just made a statement that he may simply rewrite the executive order and issue a new one on Monday. So we'll all wait and see. Again, I think we don't know whether we're in the mode of more White House action on the executive order that relates to the travel ban, or whether we're in the mode of litigation. I mean, right now we're clearly in both. Aside from what's happening on the Ninth Circuit, which is very dramatic and very legally fascinating procedurally, something very disturbing has been happening. Today, we're getting reports from all over the country, and the Washington Post just did an article on raids. And so these are immigration officers who, in our experience, will often go into homes where there are children sleeping, there are families sleeping. They tend to come between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning, and they scoop everybody up. And if they're undocumented, they are very quickly deported. There's very little due process given, even if the people swept up in the raids are victims of crime. Even if they have the ability to become legal, they're often not given an opportunity to make legal arguments on behalf of themselves. Children are separated from their mothers. We heard a report of one undocumented immigrant who showed up to court as she was supposed to because she had a hearing, and they scooped her up in the courtroom and immediately deported her while her children were at home. And so we're getting reports of these raids and that they have increased today. There's a good Washington Post article today that cites raids known in 6 cities and several hundreds of people who have been swept up. What's very concerning about this, and different from what happened in the last administration, there were raids during the last administration, but what's different about this is that it is in response to another executive order. It's a second executive order. The travel ban is really what people are talking about, but there's another executive order. There were 3 altogether that dealt with immigration in the United States, and the second and the third, which have not really been discussed very much in the press, dealt with the treatment of immigrants who are already in the United States. The travel ban dealt with immigrants who are outside trying to come in. The raids that we're seeing right now are in clear response to, or apparent response to, the other 2 executive orders, which, in contradiction to presidential campaign pledges that deportations would be focused on convicted criminals, the executive order instead focuses on pretty much everybody. There are 6 different points that are made in that executive order around who would be prioritized. They include, at the top, of course, convicted criminals, but then it goes on to say, or if you've been charged of a crime, even if you haven't been found guilty. Then it says, or if you have committed an act that could be a chargeable offense. And then it goes on, and the very last one is, or in the judgment of any immigration officer, you have done anything that may, or it appears as though you are a threat to public safety. And so that's kind of a big net categorization for, frankly, racial profiling and just any subjective determination that you look like you could potentially be a threat. And so it's not limited to convicted criminals. This is hugely problematic, particularly for the Tahirih Justice Center's clients. It is common that our clients, let's say, for example, in a domestic violence situation, will have a charge made against them. So he is choking her or suffocating her, and she bites his hand. And in an instant like that, the police may arrive at the home and they may charge her with assault while they're also charging him with assault. During the court process, the judge will figure out that that was in self-defense. She'll be absolved, but she may have the charge on her record. But abusers will often use the system as a further tool of abuse. This same woman is married to a U.S. citizen, and she should have been legal. In fact, she should have been a U.S. citizen by now by virtue of her long 10-year marriage to this guy. But because as a further tool of abuse, he kept her undocumented, and she had a charge against her, she would now be swept up in these priority deportations according to the most recent executive order that prioritizes who should be deported. So we're seeing it being implemented. We're seeing raids now happening across the country. It's extremely concerning. And then there's drama on the Ninth Circuit, and where Last night, we felt certain that the next step was the Supreme Court, and then this afternoon, the White House said we're probably not going to appeal to the Supreme Court. All that has changed because now the White House is saying we may in fact appeal the decision to the Supreme Court, and this one judge on the Ninth Circuit is asking all 25 judges to vote after arguments made on Thursday about whether the whole court should hear en banc and basically revisit, second guess the decision that was made last night by the 3-judge panel that heard arguments. So it continues to be interesting. Have a good evening.